official podcast of the Jacksonville Public Library.
That's Jenna.
This is Hurley.
Hello, it is me.
How's it going?
Great, how are you?
Welcome to another Monday in Jacksonville, Florida.
It's a beautiful Monday.
It is.
It's good to be alive on a Monday, and today, on this Monday, we're talking to Dr. Tracy Alloway.
That's right. We have another UNF professor in the building, Associate Professor of Psychology. Dr. Tracy Alloway is here, and she is fascinating.
She really is. She's one of the baddest ladies in science in the city, nay, in the country. And we can really say that because she is pretty well known around the country, around the globe,
Yes.
for her research.
Yes. She's been invited to speak in 20 different countries.
Can you say that, listener? I didn't think so. Unless Dr. Alloway's listening. She could say that.
She's the best. She's also, her book, she's written 8 books about working memory and other psychology things that are really cool.
Have you written 8 books? I didn't think so.
No, unless it's you, Dr. Alloway.
Hi again.
Hey, thanks for coming. Oh, and she's published over 100 scientific articles.
Whew, I'm not going to say it again, but I want to. We talked with Dr. Alloway about working memory, which she will explain to you all. And we also talked about something called barefoot running.
I'm going to try it, maybe.
Yeah.
Will you?
Yes.
I'm skeptical, but
I just don't want to cut up my feet.
remember when those toe shoes were like a big
Oh,
thing?
Vibram 5 fingers.
Yes.
I had a pair.
You didn't.
I did, yeah. Yeah. And then my husband told me he would leave me if I didn't get rid of them.
That's fair.
Yeah.
I would.
We're still together. I got rid of them.
Good for you.
Thanks.
Yeah, they're pretty hideous.
Yeah.
But apparently they were good. We should have asked her about those. Ooh.
Oh, we should
I
have.
want to know if they're good for your feet. Or I guess just going barefoot is way better.
Well, she's going to tell us about that barefoot running, like actually going barefoot, not copping out with those in between glove shoes.
Yeah.
It's really good for your memory.
Yes. And she would tell us all about that. Brian, do that thing.
Do it. Whatever it is you do, do it. Please go for it, Brian.
Woo!
Dr. Alloway, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So first of all, I want to know about your background as a psychologist. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So my area of research interest and expertise is in something called working memory. And I spent over a decade examining this issue. I've had a chance to look at it in the context of education, learning disabilities, how we make decisions. And so I'm very excited to be here to talk about some of that.
Wonderful. So tell us, what is working memory?
That's a great question. I like to think of working memory as your active memory. So it's the memory that you're using when you're listening to a conversation. So there's one part, which is you're taking in that new information if someone is telling you a fact. But the second part is the working part, where you have to retrieve something from your long-term memory and try to synthesize that information. So for example, at a dinner party, you meet Susie. You first have to remember Susie's name and where she's working, and then you use your long-term memory and say, oh, that's that organization I really wanted to get in touch with, and it's working memory that puts those two pieces together.
You've written a variety of books on the subject of working memory, including a children's book called Remember 10 with Explorer Ben. What do you recommend for parents who want to start their children off on the right foot with, you know, utilizing and sharpening their working memories?
I love that children's book, Remember 10 with Explorer Ben. It's really geared for the little ones 5 to 7 years old. And what's great about it is this little character, Ben, goes on these different adventures. And on each page, I give a memory tip to help little kids remember, whether it's a song or a picture. And that little memory tip helps the explorer Ben because he keeps losing everything. And it's something, you know, we all experience, but certainly when you're little and you're starting kindergarten and there's a lot to keep in mind, I find those tips are really great. I'm really excited because with the same publisher, I just signed a 4-book contract with them.
Wow.
for kids' books. And that's geared specifically to looking at different learning needs, but creating them as superheroes. So we have a little boy, Sammy, who's got dyslexia, which is, you know, he has difficulty reading and so on. So in his storyline, he's been given the task of reading a map as part of his Boy Scouts. And it's very difficult for him, but he becomes a superhero because his strength is his visual memory. And so when the map gets blown away by the wind, Sammy's amazing visual memory can can lead the troop back home safely. And so that's the first book that's coming out, and there's ones for ADHD, for autism, for anxiety. And I love the idea of just sort of flipping it and saying, let's stop looking at the weaknesses and let's look at how we can use their strengths and make them superheroes.
Oh, wow. Congratulations. That's so exciting.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I know we talked with another author recently about representation in books, and this is a whole different type of representation in children's books. You know, people that do learn differently, you know, maybe just in a different way, and representing those, you know, maybe struggles and kind of, you know, how you can pick up in other areas, I think is just as important. So that's really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, so you said in Remember 10 with Explore Ben, you offer a variety of tips for sort of sharpening your memory. What are some of those tips?
So for kids, one of the things is create a song. I mean, kids love singing anyway. And so on each page, the Explorer has 10 things to remember, which is kind of a lot, even if for an adult. And so we create a little song to help them remember. Another tip is to put things in groups or in categories. So one of the examples is Ben goes off to the Arctic and he has to have all his different equipment. And so one of the tips is, well, put everything that's head related in one category. Put everything that's, you know, kind of gloves or clothing related in another category, and equipment in another category. And those chunks are a great way to remember, because instead of remembering 10 things, you just remember 3 chunks. And that's far more doable. So different things like that are really helpful.
Very nice. And what about tips for adults?
There's so many. So I have a couple of books that are geared just for, you know, the general reader. One is part of the For Dummies series. It's called Training Your Brain for Dummies, because it's part of the series. And there's loads of tips for if you have to remember someone's name at a party, for example, using a visual cue. So you can say, oh, that's Susie with the short hair. So you've got S for Susie, S for short, something like that. That if you like alliteration or something visual, if you actually create the name in your head with a picture of maybe the dress or outfit that they were wearing is another tip. And another book that we have is called The Working Memory Advantage. And I know you guys have it here as well.
We sure do, yeah.
So that book has a whole load of tips from not just little memory-related strategies, but everything that you can do in daily life to maximize your memory. So one example would be the food that we eat, and all of it's research-based. So there's a lot of studies to show that flavonoid-rich foods are a great booster for your working memory. And flavonoid foods are the ones that have the rich color, the blue in blueberries, the green in kale or spinach. If you don't like the taste of kale, put it in a smoothie with some blueberries and you've got, you know, double benefit right there. So it's just different things like that. Dark chocolate, as we're heading into colder weather for us here in Florida. Dark chocolate is a great benefit for working memory if it's 70% cocoa solids or higher. So things like that. Something that I give my college students is using peppermint oil or rosemary oil. And both of those studies have found that it can actually improve working memory right away. So I kind of describe it as a continuum. If you want that quick boost for your working memory, that immediate effect, things like peppermint and rosemary oil help. And that's because it works with something called acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter in our brain. And the rosemary and peppermint kind of opens that up. It allows us to pass information faster and more efficiently from A to B and inside our brain. And so that's one of the reasons why researchers think it's so helpful. And then if you go a little ways down the continuum, we have other things that if you do 16 minutes of barefoot running, I know we've talked a little bit about that. And we published some research with UNF students in the Brooks College of Health looking at when you take your shoes off to run, that can improve working memory by more than 20%. So you've got immediate boost with your essential oils or some essential oils. You've got 16 minutes of barefoot running to see a 20% or more improvement in working memory. And then if you're more persistent, you can do things like blueberries and flavonoid-rich foods, and you see that benefit over a few weeks.
Wonderful, yeah. So I know something that's on everybody's minds all the time is Alzheimer's prevention. Mm-hmm. Are any of these tips good for preventing Alzheimer's?
And that is a fantastic question, because you're right. I mean, none of us can fight getting older. But the good news is that we don't have to experience the memory decline that accompanies aging. Some of the studies that I mentioned, the chocolate study, the blueberry study, and even a study looking at loose leaf green tea, all of those have been done with populations of over 65. So we're seeing that there's not a time that's too late for you to improve your memory. It's unlike other skills like language learning, for example, where there is a critical period, a window that if you don't learn language before 7, you kind of miss some of that opportunity. We see that isn't the case with our working memory. It's constantly dynamic and malleable. And so even over 65, there are lots of things we can do. One of my favorite studies is one that I write about in the book, The Working Memory Advantage. And it was actually done with a group of nuns looking in the context of Alzheimer's. And the reason nuns were selected is because they represent a fairly homogenous group. They have a very similar diet, very similar lifestyle, and so on. So all of these are kept constant, which we know can contribute to Alzheimer's. And so what they found was very interesting, that after they passed, a lot of them donated their brains for research. And some of them showed the signs in the brain, the kind of the taus, the tangles, the plaque buildup that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. But what was interesting was that when they were alive, they did not show the cognitive signs of Alzheimer's. And so the researchers called this group of nuns asymptomatic Alzheimer's. In other words, they didn't show the symptomology of Alzheimer's, though when they passed, their brains showed the signs. And so they're really puzzled. It's a bit of a mystery. Why does your brain show these signs, but in cognitive functioning, even the nurses would say, oh, assistant so-and-so, of course she didn't have Alzheimer's. She was, bright and clear as day right up till the very end. And what they found is that they were able to tie it back to an activity that the nuns did when they were in their 20s. And that was writing their journals, that the nuns had to keep journals on a regular basis. And they found a big difference between the type of writing that they did. So the nuns who were very descriptive, who were very evocative in their writing, who used adjectives, they were the ones that were more likely to have asymptomatic Alzheimer's, which means they tricked their brain. Their brain was showing these tangles and tau buildup of Alzheimer's, but cognitively, they weren't showing those benefits. And one of the reasons, researchers have suggested writing is so critical is because there's a huge working memory component. So they had samples of the nuns' journals where one example that was very simple entry was, I went to the garden to say a prayer. Then you have something more descriptive. I went to the garden to pray. The grass was wet with dew. I could hear the birds. It was very peaceful. So that kind of writing style was more strongly associated with not showing the cognitive signs of Alzheimer's.
That's fascinating. Mm-hmm. And it makes me wonder, is it the act of writing it down, or is it just thinking in terms of like more descriptive ways of describing something?
And I think because of the time in which the nuns were writing, they were actually writing rather than, speech to text or something that we may have access to now. But there's other research to suggest that the act of writing itself, when it comes to goal-setting behavior, there's something very powerful. And it's not entirely clear if it's because we're engaging multiple parts of our brain, the motor component, the emotion in writing. And so you're reinforcing that behavior on multiple levels, not just the cognitive, but also the motor aspect. You're associating some emotion with that. And it's more of a deeper processing of that information. But certainly research that looks at when you write down a goal, like today, my goal is to do this. Here are 3 ways in which I'll accomplish that goal. That seems to have a lot of power and seems to be more persistent. It helps people not only feel better, but actually accomplish those goals. And research has looked at that in the context of more pain management and healthcare settings, and found that when people actually write down ways in which they will manage their pain, it's far more effective than just thinking about what they'll do.
Fascinating, because they have to think through it in order to write it. That makes sense. Yeah.
And I know you said the motor skills. I guess typing would have the same effect because it's still the same thing, hitting the keys.
It could well be. I think the idea is that you're getting it out of your head and you're actually seeing that. So you're engaging your visual aspect as well as, like you said, that cognitive processing, that working memory piece to think, okay, step 1 and step 2 and so on.
Interesting. And you've also done a lot of research in ADHD and kind of how it affects men and women differently. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think right now, so I also get a chance to work at a clinic here locally. And what is fascinating is that when you see people talk about ADHD, it's often the idea of one size fits all. And by that, I mean, for boys and girls, it's all the same. But in fact, I found even in my own research that the expression of ADHD is very different for boys and girls. For boys, they're far more physical, they're far more active. And for girls, they tend to be more distracted or inattentive. And that also relates to how our brain is functioning. So we know with ADHD, the motor cortex that's responsible for a movement is overactive in someone with ADHD. So that's that fidgetiness, that needing to move all the time, to tap your fingers or rock your feet or something. But conversely, the prefrontal cortex, and that's the home of working memory, is underactive. And so you've got this dissociation where your motor cortex is pushing you to move and your prefrontal cortex isn't there to tell you to stop moving. And so that's why you hear the saying, someone with ADHD is like a fast race car with no brakes because they just want to keep going. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that when we come to boys and girls, they may express that very differently. For the girls, that motor cortex may be also affecting the way they think. So their thoughts may be racing and hence they're disengaging from what's in front of them. But the boys physically, they need that physical energy. And that's exactly what one of my colleagues found. He contributed to a book that I edited. It's a clinical textbook on working memory and different developmental disorders, including ADHD. And their research was incredibly interesting. They found that when they put one of those movement trackers on the ankles of children with ADHD, the more movement they exhibited in a short period of time, the better their working memory was. And it sounds counterintuitive. You're thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, we want our kids to sit still and learn. But if you think about that ADHD brain, if you have a limited resource in your working memory and you have to use that limited resource to try to tell yourself to stop moving, you don't have much left over to try to focus on what the teacher is telling you. So when they were actually allowed to move freely in the classroom, their working memory was also free to say, oh, I don't have to tell myself to stop doing this. Now I can listen to what teacher is telling me. And it's exciting to see that many classrooms across the U.S. are taking this information on board. They often have stationary bikes for some kids to sit on in the classroom, stand-up desks. Some have wobble boards, different things like that to allow students that need to move the ability to move in a classroom setting.
I always thought about that. That's what I was thinking when you were saying this. Like, ooh, this is the thing for like treadmill desks or stationary bikes. That's cool. I wonder if anyone in Duval County is doing that.
They should.
Yeah, they should.
I hope they will. You've been conducting some pretty fascinating research on PTSD lately, research that involves coloring of all things. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, it was recently published, in fact, and I'm very excited that we had a chance to work with the veteran community here in Jacksonville. What we did is there's a lot of research on art therapy more generally, and even coloring. You hear all these claims, coloring is great for your mental health, it's very calming, and we wanted to be able to substantiate some of these claims. And there's very limited research, first of all, on coloring, and most of that is involving colored students because they're an easy population. But we wanted to look at people that really may benefit the most from this type of activity. So we worked with the Veterans Association here in Jacksonville, and we were able to recruit veterans. We gave them a Ptsd Screener, and it's a very quick screener that's often used in primary healthcare settings, and it's a self-reported symptomology. And from that, we could identify veterans who were expressing self-reported PTSD symptoms and those who weren't. And then we gave them 2 different activities. They did both of them. One of the activities, like you mentioned, Hurley, was coloring, and we gave them a mandala specifically to color, and 20 minutes. And the second activity was just a blank piece of paper, and we said, here's a blank piece of paper, draw whatever you like. The results were very different depending on what activity they were engaging in. So we found that coloring the mandala was only beneficial for the veterans that had expressed PTSD symptomology. We found that they reported a reduction in their stress and their anxiety. And it makes sense because a lot of researchers suggest that a mandala specifically is a very meditative type of activity because of the symmetry and so on. And it can induce a sense of mindfulness that you can just kind of forget everything and just be very present focused. And so we think that the use of a mandala specifically may have led to this benefit in stress, reduction of stress and anxiety. Now, when it came to drawing, that was a very different story. Some of them actually found that quite stressful. They would look at the piece of paper and say, what are we supposed to do with this? And one vet actually ended up writing his weekly schedule because he just wasn't really sure what he should be drawing. And so we didn't find mental health benefits with drawing. We did find working memory benefits. We found that regardless of whether they were expressing PTSD symptomology, all of the veterans were showing improvements to their working memory after 20 minutes of drawing. And again, if you think of the process involved in staring at a blank piece of paper and creating something, you first of all have to create a goal. What is it that I want to draw? And then you have to have a plan. All of that involves working memory. And so it's encouraging to see that in 20 minutes we can have both mental health benefits or working memory benefits depending on what it is that we choose to do. And we know that, especially with veterans, PTSD is highly prevalent in that community. And I think this is, for us, an exciting first step to know that they could be some self-directed activities that they can engage in and then obviously seek help if they need to further on.
Interesting. So what are some other things that we can do to stay present, as you said, like practice mindfulness just by being present with coloring, or are there any other ways to do that?
In the classroom, I have a colleague who's done research looking at doodling with school children. And if you find that you have a child that's easily distracted or a daydreamer, then doodling can help them stay on task. And I even tell this to my college students. I said, if we're doing a particularly difficult activity, grab that paper and a pencil and just start doodling. And that is the reason that works with keeping you engaged, is because you're not shutting off entirely. And it's easy for us to do when something is very difficult or very challenging. Our instinct is just to say, okay, I'm thinking about something else, maybe my weekend plans or my lunch and so on. But doodling keeps you minimally engaged. And they found that people were able to retain more information after doodling than when they weren't.
Wow.
Are
you a doodler?
Yeah, I was going to say I do that all the time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's so
interesting. And sometimes I'm like, oh man, this is so rude, but I'm still listening to what they're saying. But I do find myself saying like, oh, I should stop. If someone else is speaking, I should pay attention. But then I'm not listening to them if I'm just staring at their forehead.
Right.
Well, you're probably remembering more than the person who is just staring at their forehead.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm going to keep doodling in meetings.
I like that you're a doodler. It's a good quality. I follow your Instagram account at Tracy P. Alloway and notice that you're a woman of many talents. Your hobbies seem to include aerial acrobatics, barefoot running, which you talked about earlier, skateboarding, stand-up paddleboarding, yoga, and the list goes on and on. We always see you doing really cool things online. And you've said that your hobbies relate to your research on the working memory. Tell us how barefoot running, aerial acrobatics, and other forms of exercise can be good for our brains.
That's fascinating because I actually did a piece with Good Morning Jacksonville on exactly that, the kind of aerial. I do the trapeze, which is the bar, and you kind of, not the flying one where someone catches me, but
maybe someday.
Maybe I'll work up to that. But it's the ones that you're actually doing, tricks on the bar and so on. And one of the reasons I think that could be great for working memory is because it involves something called proprioception. And proprioception simply means you are aware of your body's position in space. And you talked about ways in which we can encourage mindfulness to the present moment. Proprioception is one of those ways. And so we published some research looking at proprioceptive activities, things like climbing a tree, barefoot crawling, those kinds of things that involve you being aware of where your body is in space at all times. And we found when we compared people who did those kinds of activities with those who did more stationary but proprioceptively aware activities like yoga, we found working memory benefits up to 20%, again, for those that were engaged in what we call proprioceptively dynamic activities. So two things need to be present. First of all, you actually had to be aware of your body's position in space. Second of all, you had to be moving. You have to, have that moment of dynamic aspect to it. And that was really beneficial for our participants, more so than just being aware, but being stationary and just thinking, okay, my feet are here on the mat, my shoulders are aligned, my hips, and so on. While that has other benefits, it didn't have working memory benefits.
Gotcha. So when I first saw one of your barefoot running posts, I got very anxious about the state of your feet. I'm sure people say that to you a lot. Like, aren't you worried about cutting your foot on something?
They do, but I think that's the beauty of it, that because you're so attentive, and that's why it's almost like you're getting a working memory workout, because you have to attend to where your feet are on the ground. And that's exactly what we did in our study on barefoot running. We had our participants do it 4 different ways. They ran on a track. And we put poker chips on the track. And the poker chips were meant to mirror the safe landing spot. So exactly like you mentioned, if you're running outside, you're trying to think, oh, I don't want to land on that pebble over there or that twig or so on. So you're constantly attending to your external environment. So we had them run on the track with chips, without chips, with shoes and without shoes. And we found that 3 things had to be in place in order to see working memory benefits. The first was time, that we only saw benefits after running for 16 minutes. It's 1-6. So not a long time. But when we tested our runners after 8 minutes of running, there was no working memory benefit. The second factor that had to be in place was the chips, that they only showed benefits when they were attending to those poker chips in the ground. Even if they were barefoot, but running without the chips, we didn't see any benefits. So in other words, running barefoot alone isn't enough. You actually have to engage your working memory to see that boost. And that leads me to the third point. It was running barefoot. So we found that it's that sensory input you were getting, that running with shoes with those poker chips did not yield improvements to working memory. But it's being attentive and getting that feedback through your feet to say, okay, yeah, that's going to hurt a little bit. I need to shift my stride over here and so on. That was constantly involving your working memory that led to those benefits.
Wow.
Yeah, that sounds like almost the doodle theory as well. Like, you have to be, when your brain's still active and not just zoning out. Because when I run, I'm zoning out. I'm trying not to think about what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense.
And it's exactly what, even when I would run with shoes, it's exactly what my goal was not to think and just kind of get in the zone and just go. And that's why running barefoot kind of switches that a little bit and gets your brain involved, not so much on a thought, but more on your environment.
I want to try it now. How do I get started? Like, what would you recommend for someone who's barefoot running for the very first time?
I would say go to the beach or somewhere soft, like a grassy patch, and just start with a few minutes, because it also changes. You use a different part of your body. So there's research up at Harvard University looking at the physiology of that. And your stride, you'll notice it more in your calves than you will in your quads. And so it's always good to start with just a few minutes and slowly build up, like any new activity. You don't want to just jump in and say, I usually run 5 miles. I'm okay 5 miles barefoot too. You'll definitely feel it
on the trails at Hannah Park, right?
Exactly.
Terrifying.
Right.
Do you do that at all?
I do the trails at UNF barefoot.
Okay. Wow. So cool. Maybe I'll build up and we can go together.
I would love that. Yes.
Barefoot running buddies. So you and I met earlier this year at the library's Women in Science panel celebrating Women's History Month. And again, thank you so much for participating in that panel.
Such a great event.
It was so much fun. I had the best time listening to these ladies talk about breaking the glass ceilings in the sciences. It was so cool. But women in science is a huge trendy topic right now. What trends have you noticed on that subject?
Yeah, I've had a chance to do a lot of speaking about that topic too. One of the things that has fascinated me was the idea of math anxiety. And we have this perception that girls aren't good at math, and that's one of the reasons why they don't pursue science-based professions. And obviously it's more complicated than that. There are a lot of factors. But one study that I found was really interesting was they looked at boys and girls, I think from 7 to 15 years of age, so huge sample, thousands of kids. And they found that girls did report more math anxiety than boys. But when they looked at their actual math performance, there was no significant difference. So in other words, we are training the girls to think you're not so good at math, or we're kind of inculcating them with a math anxiety story. And there's other research to show that sometimes it comes from the parents, where the parents might say, oh, I'm not good at math. You don't need to worry about math either. Or even a teacher who may feel a little nervous about teaching math and then may inadvertently convey that to his students. And it's the female students that tend to pick up on that. And it could be because women are more relationship driven, more empathetic. So our kind of, spidey senses are tingling. And so when a teacher's expressing some of that anxiety, we're quick to pick up on that and internalize that.
Wow. So what do you recommend to educators, to parents for sort of getting over this hump of math anxiety?
I think this is one case where that disconnect is very encouraging. The disconnect between anxiety and performance. In other words, you're having the anxiety, but you don't need to, because your performance is actually better than you think it's going to be. And so I think just changing the story and reframing it. And it's okay to acknowledge that you may be nervous about an exam or even doing a particularly hard task, but instead of focusing on the anxiety or the fear part of it, create a goal and say, well, okay, you're worried about this math exam. What's one thing you're going to do so that you will be successful in that? And so you're switching their perspective from focusing on that anxiety and making them be in control. You're allowing them the power to act. You're saying, choose something you're going to do. Be an actor in this situation rather than a receiver of this anxiety.
Right. And how can we encourage more women to enter the sciences as a career?
That's a great question. I think having positive role models is a great first step. And that's why I think that event that you guys organize is so fantastic, because you hear, girls are seeing, oh, there are women that are doing that. I don't have to be restricted in my professional choices or my career aspirations. And so I think highlighting that is really fantastic. The book that I mentioned with ADHD, the clinical textbook, it's published by Routledge, the big education textbook, and they are doing a series of the top 100 women in science. And so just those kinds of ways are great to say, hey, look, these are what women are doing in science, and it makes it more visible. And I think when we create this visibility, then it's easy for young girls to identify and say, wow, Dr. Susie or Dr. Jane, they're doing exciting things too. I could be like that.
Or Dr. Alloway. Hey, she's sitting right here.
Exactly.
I'll take it. Yeah. Well, we have one more question for you, Dr. Alloway. We ask this at the end of all of our interviews. Mm-hmm. We want to know, when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Funnily enough, it was a psychologist. I always wanted to be a psychologist. And I think I like the the idea of the human brain and sort of a little bit of the detective in me. It's a puzzle. You want to solve these little mysteries. Why do we act this way? Why do we think one thing but do a different thing? And yeah, so ever since I was young.
Very cool. Well, I'm so glad you did. Thanks for being a role model for young girls and older ladies too. I mean,
us.
Hey, you're kind of my role model. I'm over here being like, be my barefoot running buddy.
And I'm saying, yes, I'll do it.
Just girl crushing hard over here. Thank you so much, Dr. Alloway. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we just got back from barefoot running.
I am pooped.
I know.
And so are my feet.
My feet are pretty gross.
We lasted 8 minutes, so we did not experience any working memory benefits, but I don't know. I think I could get into this.
Yeah.
Yeah. I felt more present when I was running, which is kind of a bad thing. When you're
because you're
running.
thinking about how much pain you're
You don't
in.
want to think about running when you're running.
That's true.
Because you're thinking about your lungs and you're thinking about your feet. And girls got mile-high arches.
Yeah.
So you do too. So
you know what I was thinking about?
What?
All the money I'm gonna save on running shoes because those things ain't cheap.
They're not.
So just don't wear any. There's the money saver.
Right. We live by the ocean. We might as well take advantage.
Yeah, just run on the beach.
Yeah.
Multiple benefits. If you want to learn more about Tracy Alloway and her amazing research on working memory, ADHD, etc., you can visit her at tracyalloway.com, or you can follow all of her barefoot running adventures. I mean, you'll probably see a post of her and Hurley running pretty soon on Instagram.
Yeah, we're gonna be best friends.
Yeah, pretty much. It's at Tracy P. Alloway on Instagram.
Follow us while you're at it at Jack's Library. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and you can learn more about our podcast at jackspubliclibrary.org/podcast. We have several of Dr. Tracy Alloway's books in our collection, including The Working Memory Advantage and Remember 10 with Explorer Ben, which is her book for kids. So make sure you put those puppies on hold. Search Tracy Alloway in authors in our catalog.
Yes, and make sure you leave us a 5-star rating and an eloquently written review because it's good for your memory to write beautifully written reviews.
I see what you did.
Mm-hmm. This podcast was produced by Brian Thomas, a.k.a. BT, a.k.a.
Producer Brian.
Goodbye!